right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Avoiding Data Disasters Workshop. My name is Ryan Nicholson. I'm the one that put this together, and if you bear with me for just a few minutes, the one speaking and introducing this content for the next 15 minutes or so, it's going to be largely hands-on, about 90 minutes or so of hands-on. I have a little bit of wrap-up at the end. But first of all, who am I? I'm the, I guess you want to say, lead cybersecurity, lead cloud security engineer for my company, Blue Mountain Cyber. Also, I wrote two SANS courses, one SEC 488, Cloud Security Essentials, which this workshop's more closely relatable, let's say, although a lot of cloud courses we have here at SANS do speak on cloud storage blunders and things of that nature. And also, I co-author with Sean McCullough the SEC 541 course, really focused on cloud detection. There's actually a little bit of that sprinkled in to this workshop as well. Now, like I said, I'm only going to spend a few minutes here up front, just introducing the workshop more or less, like mentioning why I put this together, what you're expected to do, what you're expected to come to the workshop with, and so on. Some of which I hope you read in the announcements for the workshop, how to be properly prepared. Although we find that sometimes that's not always the case. No big deal though. You can quickly get an AWS account stood up in a matter of minutes in a lot of cases and not lose out on the workshop. And to add to that, if for some reason things aren't working for you, or you didn't have an account, it's not able to be used right away, let's say, or maybe you're waiting on one to be provisioned by your company or something like that, I do keep this workshop public facing for the foreseeable future. So you can always revisit the workbook at a later time, or if you run out of time or what have you. There is no real limitation to this workshop, at least in the foreseeable future. I tend to keep these around for quite some time. All right. So with that, let's see what we're going to get ourselves into here. There's going to be 6 exercises, 5 of which are going to be focused on the workshop content itself. The 6th one is just a way to tear things down. I mentioned that one because a question that often arises with these workshops where you're bringing your own cloud accounts is, how much is this going to cost me? I try to design, whether it's a lab for SANS or a workshop or just something I do personally, with cost in mind first and foremost, because if I want to share it with others, I don't want to say, hey, others, this is going to cost you $300 just to play with this cool thing. That is not the case here. It's going to be pennies, minutes to stand up an account, pennies to operate the account during this workshop. And I say that it might be 2-3 cents, because we're literally going to stand up one S3 bucket with one file in it. Shouldn't cost you anything. And if it does, like I said, it's mere pennies. But you don't want that lingering around forever. And those pennies do eventually add up to maybe $1. So we have exercise 6 to tear all of that down for you just by running a simple cleanup script at the very end. The 5 exercises, those you can see are titled pretty nicely about what you're going to do. Like the big mistake, you're going to do something that all too commonly happens out in the greater cloud world is, and we don't want to blame the vendors here, although I've got some things to say about here in a little bit, but customers misconfiguring their cloud storage is ultimately what we're going to do in exercise 1 on purpose. However, it's fictitious data that we're protecting in this cloud storage, but we're eventually going to begin to lock that down, starting with exercise 2. You're going to shut down, and spoiler alert, there's going to be some public access to this bucket. You're going to stop that and also prevent it from happening in the future in this AWS account. That is a little heavy-handed, I want to mention. So if you're using a work account and you do on purpose want to share certain things publicly in the S3 service, this will break that. So I just want to make that very, very clear that I recommend that you look at these prevention and detection actions very closely that we're going to do if you're in a shared account or a corporate account. I actually really highly recommend coming to this workshop with an account that you don't care about, that there's nothing in there that matters for these types of workshops. Okay, I just want to, again, throw that out there. Use at your own risk if you're not in a sandbox or a development style AWS account. Exercise 3, we're going to focus on availability, because this is going to be crucial data for our organization. We'll want to make sure it sticks around. If it's altered, we can always roll back to that original known good state and so on. Exercise 4 focuses on monitoring. I've got a dedicated bullet coming up shortly talking about that exercise. And I'm not complaining about AWS. Many cloud vendors are this way. When you set up monitoring, it takes a little bit of time for that evidence to start showing up. But once it does start showing up, it shows up pretty rapidly after that. So if you get into exercise 4 and you're waiting for log data to show up and it's been several minutes, I would recommend just moving on, maybe revisiting that later. But if you're going to revisit exercise 4, that last challenge later on, don't tear down your resources. Don't do exercise 6 yet until you're satisfied with exercise 4, then blow everything away. So if you do that, you're gonna have to rebuild everything again from scratch, and the waiting begins all over again. Exercise 5, again, the last one of our real work here, is going to be reviewing what we've done. We're going to be running an audit tool, which I'll mention in a little bit up front, see how bad this deployment was, and then see the fruits of our efforts. Like what did we close? What red X's turned into green check marks, and so on. But also we're going to discuss shifting left here, because I'm sure a lot of you, when you get into exercise 1, you're like, why am I deploying this? I haven't looked at this code yet. I'm just blindly trusting that this is secure. That doesn't sound like a good idea. And it's not, but does happen all too often. So if security can be involved as early and often as possible, we should be. That's what I mean by shifting left. We're going to be looking at a tool called Checkoff, which can look at your proposed infrastructure as code deployment. In other words, some code that you hand to a tool and it builds in cloud for you. Try to get in front of those potential vulnerabilities. Okay, so we'll see that at the very end, actually. And then I have some, like I said, last minute thoughts and Q&A saved just a few minutes at the end here, maybe 10 minutes on the back end of this. So it's largely hands-on throughout this workshop. So again, just a couple more slides to go here. Talk about why I created the workshop in general. As you can see, very first bullet, I've read news articles, right? I'm sure a lot of you have, where you'll see things like, oh, there's another one, another S3 bucket exposed to the internet. First of all, I want to say, I'm sure vendors have a lot of damage control when these sorts of things happen, like AWS. I'm sure every breach involving S3, they're getting a lot of questions, or they're having to do that damage control, getting in front of this saying, wasn't us, it was one of our customers. And that is largely true. Now, this is my opinion, not Sands' opinion. If a vendor can get in front of some of these things, make it harder for the customer to make themselves vulnerable, I'm a huge, huge fan of that. So I think, again, my opinion here, there is some fault to the vendor, maybe not making things as clear, or maybe some insecure defaults that I think should be in that secure state. Now, I get the opposite argument of that, because if we do all of these things that we're going to do in this workshop to every single bit of cloud storage we have, and we should, if we're going to be protecting it, but if we did that in every single account for every single customer, the cost will add up. That might not be a good look for the vendor either. Like, for example, if to deploy an S3 bucket, you also had to have access logging on, and you had to have a bunch of security services on, monitoring the configuration of that bucket, what's happening to that bucket, what requests are being made, spot or abnormalities, all that stuff that we talk about in our courses. That's quite expensive, right? That's going to probably dissuade some customers from using that service. They just want something cheap and easy to use. But as you'll see in a little bit, that ease of use sometimes comes back to bite you if you don't know what you're doing with the service or how to adequately lock it down. So with cloud storage, as you can imagine, to the vendor's perspective, they don't care what you put in it, which means it could be things like proprietary data, classified information, really anything sensitive could end up in these buckets. So if you're not adequately protecting it, again, that's where those news articles happen. So some of the breaches, though, to the storage, I have some listed here. A very common one is public-facing storage, which means there's no access control whatsoever. Largely, you just need a link to the data or the bucket or the container, depending on what your vendor wants to call it, to ultimately get access to that information. So bad news right off the bat. And that's what we'll see in our deployment right away. But also, you have the ability to share information by creating shareable links. Well, those links can get out into the wild as well. And those without need to know could get access to that information. And of course, many breaches in cloud begin with exposed credentials, stolen cloud credentials to that cloud account. And depending on the scope and permissions of what those credentials provide the attacker, they could either have a field day or have very limited access to that environment. But that access could involve access to sensitive information in cloud storage. A lot of talks since 2019, which is when it happened, discussed the Capital One breach. That's an example of that. An attacker acquired cloud credentials in a very crafty way by abusing another cloud capability, which there's many talks on this. I won't go into extreme detail, but once those credentials were lifted, they were able to access S3 data, cloud storage data inside the Capital One environment. And my data was involved in that, of course. So that's why it's near and dear to me. So I want to get you out in front of a lot of these potential issues. This example will be in AWS. Again, I'm not throwing stones at Amazon. These things could easily happen in Azure, could easily happen in GCP, could easily happen in Oracle, you name it, okay? Now, if you have any questions at all, I should have mentioned this right off the bat. We do have Slack. The link to Slack, oddly enough, is in the Zoom chat. So if you join Slack and ask questions there when the time comes, I'll ask for questions right before we get into the labs, as well as during the labs and at the very end. Just shoot them my way. There's a few different channels in there. Let me pull them up so I have the exact name of them. They are discuss. If you just want to chat about anything in general related to this or anything cloud or anything at all, we have the discuss channel. But if you're having issues with these challenges coming up, these exercises, help. I'll be monitoring the help one largely. You can send me stuff in the Zoom chat. I'm not as reactive to that, though. I'm going to be hyper-focusing on Slack. So I'm going to encourage you to go to the workshop workspace and post any questions or comments or what have you. Okay. So that's the why I created the workshop. Again, this just kind of extends upon that why. Many breaches. I just grabbed a few headlines actually this morning. No, this isn't all from this morning, but this morning I did a search for some headlines and came up with a large number just within the last couple of years. I'm sure there were many more where that came from that just didn't make the news, didn't make the front page of the Google search results and stuff like that. But as you can see, many customers, when they're not configuring their storage properly or not protecting that data as adequately as they should be or could be, it leads into these scenarios, right? Just lots of data stolen, sometimes valuable data, well, oftentimes valuable data if it makes the news headlines, of course. Okay, so we want to get in front of this. I don't want you in your organization to be another one of these headlines. So some of the tooling we're going to use in this workshop, I mentioned infrastructure as code. We're going to be using CloudFormation. That's by AWS for AWS to describe more or less, here's the cloud resources I want you to deploy, and here's how they should be configured. You can write in two different formats, JSON, JavaScript object notation, or YAML. I believe it stands for YAML ain't markup language nowadays. But either we're going to be using a YAML syntax for ours. But that, again, is explained to Amazon here. Shut up and build this, basically, is what we're telling it. Now, that shut up and build this is going to be in a rather insecure state. You could, of course, eyeball that. You could go into S3, poke around at the settings, say, yeah, that doesn't look right. But we're going to automate that work by using a security tool, in this case called S3 Audit. Now, I know that this tool is has been sunsetted, this version of it. It's written in Node.js. The developers currently migrated that code to Rust. The Node.js one works just fine. It does what we need to do for this workshop. Just note there's a more improved one out there. The reason I chose the older one is it just works very well inside of AWS's Cloud Shell environment. You're given very little space in Cloud Shell. Just think of it like a command line environment that you spin up in your web browser or access via your web browser from AWS, and other vendors have this as well. But you're given finite amount of space. To use the Rust tool, there's a lot of compiling and a lot of extra storage required. And I've never been successful. I'll admit it there. So that would be reserved for like a virtual machine or a local host environment, not necessarily Cloud Shell. So again, we're going to use the Node.js version for that reason and that reason alone. Later in exercise 5, I was mentioning that we're going to scan our code looking for potential issues before we deploy it, like we should have done all along. That tool we're going to use for that, which can read CloudFormation, Terraform, Azure Resource Manager templates, all that infrastructure as code stuff, is Checkoff. So again, Checkoff is you feed it a file or a directory and say, here, look at this. Let me know if what I'm about to deploy is going to contain any vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. Okay, so you'll see that before picture, all kinds of vulnerabilities. We're going to have a new and improved template at the very end that should come back with no vulnerabilities whatsoever, according to Checkoff. Okay, so that's the tooling that we're going to be using throughout the workshop. I got to mention this though too. We have run into some potential issues here, because I can't predict exactly what AWS account you're going to be showing up with. Is it an account that's a member of an AWS organization? If that's the case, there could be service control policies getting in the way of some of the things you're trying to do. Those policies simply are limitations, guardrails on those supported accounts. So if your organization says, you know what, no one in our organization is allowed to create public storage, that will break basically the whole workshop, at least the very beginning of the workshop, exercise 1, because you deploy that purposely vulnerable thing. If that's not possible, you'll have some failure messages show up. Okay, so that may get in the way, which means you may have to loosen those permissions or maybe use a different account. Another thing that may get in the way is improper permissions. In our guidance, we recommended that you come with an AWS account, but also administrator level access. Now, that admittedly is overkill. In fact, something we talk about in Sec 488 is stop making everybody an admin in your cloud account. You should be working towards least privilege. So the least privilege for this workshop, to be fair, I didn't create an exact replica of everything that should be least privilege, but at the very least, you should have access to the Cloud Shell service, so you can get to that command line environment. You're going to be using your browser as well, kind of going back and forth. Cloud formation, that's how you're going to deploy your resources. And the resources that are being deployed are going to be, and changed, are going to be in the S3 service. If you have full access to all of those, you should be just fine. And not one last thing, well, two last things. First being, there's a setting that is S3 wide that can be set in your account that, if is set, will again break exercise 1. And that is block public access settings for this account. So what that simply means is no S3 bucket in this AWS account can ever be public. So if you try to make one public, again, you have failure messages. So I have some quick and dirty instructions to undo that, at least for now, because you're going to be setting that anyway throughout the workbook, or workshop, but it will impede exercise 1. So it's go to the S3 service. On the left-hand side, there's a block public access settings for this account item, I guess. Click on that. And there's a bit of a workflow. You got to click on edit, uncheck all the boxes, which means allow things to be public, confirm it, and so on. If this is the case for you, I can post this all in Slack and say, here's your quick instructions to make this happen, to undo this, if you run into those weird errors in exercise 1. And I've said this before, but it's worth repeating. When you get to exercise 4, just realize that logging won't happen right away. I'll just leave it at that. Sometimes it's minutes, sometimes it's hours. So you may have to revisit the last challenge in exercise 4, maybe even after the workshop is over. Okay, just making you aware of that. Again, that's not an AWS thing. That's, in my experience, many vendors. When you say start logging this, and then you immediately go looking for the log data, it's not going to be there for a little bit. But once it's there, then the data starts flowing in relatively quickly, within a couple minutes, I would say, in my experience. All right, so with that, that's it. So you might be wondering, well, where are these exercises? I just posted in the general channel of Slack, another reason to go to Slack. 2 links, really one is the most important one. That's, of course, the workbook. There's an online workbook for this. So let me pull it over, actually. When you arrive at the avoidingdatadisasters.sanscloudwars.com, you actually end up here. Go back to the home page, right? You might be wondering, well, where are the exercises? Well, there's a link at the very top called exercises. If you click on that, it should make exercise 1 appear for you. And during this time, I'm not going to say go through exercise 1. When you're done, wait for me to come back. Now, you're just going to do all 5 exercises, the first 5 exercises, the 6th one if you want to tear everything down, over the next 90 minutes or so. And when we're done, I'm going to just do a quick recap of what we've done. Stick around for any Q&A, that kind of stuff. All right, so it's largely going to be you from here on out. I just want to mention one more thing. If you're unfamiliar with these online workbooks, the way I've designed this, and how you may see in a lot of other SANS classes like Sec 488, 541, really any cloud class and many other SANS classes, it'll lay out the objectives. Like, here's what we want you to do at a very high level. Then we get into the individual challenges. Now, all of the challenges, you'll see this solution bar. If you click on that, that will give you the exact steps to meet that challenge. Otherwise, you can challenge yourself, but realize you have some limited time here. So you may need to look ahead, look at the solution to be successful, or to get through the exercises in the time allotted. But if you're like, you know what, I know S3 like the back of my hand, let's see if I can do all this myself, by all means do it. So there's really 2 paths you can take, the hard mode and the easier mode. Easier mode being, look at the solution, follow the instructions. You will have learned how to accomplish that task, okay? Hard mode is, don't look at the solution, try to figure it out. Hardest mode would be, and I had this happen when I did a workshop before. I had a student that would try to do everything via the command line, every single thing, command line. So I would say that's hardest mode, because a lot of the solution steps are using the graphical user interface. So if you want to try it, the AWS CLI is in that environment, by all means, go for it. That would be absolute hard mode, beast mode, I would say. All right, so again, over these next few minutes, and I do see some raised hands here in Zoom. So if you if you have any questions whatsoever, Slack is the place to go. There are those two channels: discuss for just any discussion, and then help if you're running into issues with the workshop. But other than that, I'm going to be largely quiet. I'll only mention anything on Zoom if there's an issue that I need to make you aware of, like a new edge case I've discovered. Like if you're in this scenario, here's how you work around it and fix it. But knock on wood, that doesn't happen. So I'll be quiet until, let's say, 11:45. So 15 minutes until 12 Eastern time. We'll regroup. I'll more or less wrap things up, stick around for any questions, and then you'll be free to go. So I'm going to try to end at exactly noon best I can. So enjoy. And like I said, I'll be off camera and be quiet unless I need to not be. All right, a little over 12 minutes left. I see a few of you hit a bit of a wall when you hit exercise 4, which I talked about, but if you missed it or forget, you may have to wait a long time sometimes for the log data to show up. So I recommend, if you're still waiting, just moving on. That way you can at least get through exercise 5. There's a lot of really interesting information and get to play around with some really neat tools in that exercise. All right, got just over 2 minutes left on our timer here. But don't worry, if you don't get through everything, and I'll say this again later, I do keep this workbook up for, I keep saying the foreseeable future, I would say at least a year. So they don't cost me very much to run these things, and I do like giving back to the community. So at your leisure, you can redo this or continue where you left off, even share the link with your friends. Lisa's asking a question right now. Will this Slack stay available for workshops, or is it just for this event? It's the same workspace for all workshops. In fact, if you scroll up a bit, you'll see some chatter from the previous workshop. However, not all the data stays there forever. It does eventually age out. So if there's something in there like links or what have you, I recommend copying them and saving them somewhere. But yes, this will be available again for the foreseeable future. This is something I don't control, but based on Sands's track record, I anticipate this being up for quite some time. All right. And it's exactly 11:45. So hopefully you enjoyed the exercises. But as I just mentioned, this workbook will be up for the foreseeable future. I'll even, if I find there's bugs or issues, I'll edit it and so on, right? So yeah, thank you all for the kind words in the discuss channel there. I have a blast putting these things together as well. This is my, fourth one I've put together for SANS, and there's more coming. So stay tuned for that. I do have a couple slides coming up yet, just to more or less talk about takeaways and give you an opportunity to ask any questions, and also provide a little more information about what we have going on in the SANS Cloud curriculum. So just bear with me for just a couple more minutes here, and I will stick around till noon if I do wrap up a little early, if you had any additional issues or questions on the exercises. So takeaways, as you found out that managing cloud storage is quite the effort. And this was just one bucket. I can imagine in your organizations you have more than one S3 bucket if you're in AWS, or more than one storage account in Azure, or more than one bucket in GCP, and so on. And you might be using Dropbox and Box.com and Microsoft 365. So a lot of these issues that we fixed in AWS aren't just AWS potential configuration problems. They can exist in a variety of cloud storage locations. So having ways to, first of all, locate your problems, like we looked at that S3 audit tool. That was one effort to say, here's a bucket, tell me what's wrong with it. You could run that at scale, which means run it across your fleet of buckets. But depending on your environment, other tools may be leveraged, or it might be a rather manual effort, or better yet, you might be writing your own scripts or programs or what have you to be able to do that analysis for you at one shot. But of course, over time, you want to keep these things in that known good security state. So having continuous monitoring of your configurations will be a huge step in the right direction. But it's not just identifying the issues. If you can automate in some way the correction of those issues, now be careful with this. ask me how I know. I may have gotten overly aggressive with some of my automation, my automatic remediation actions where I maybe caused damage to the environment or placed too much restriction on something that needed to be opened up slightly. So just test things adequately, of course, but if the more you can automate, the better, to stop the issues in their tracks, immediately correct them, and so on. Because as you saw, it's quite a bit of effort to make single changes sometimes. Imagine doing those changes across 1,000 buckets or 1,000 OneDrive configurations and so on. It becomes quite well, not a problem, but quite the undertaking. If you could automate that away, that would be great. The only other thing I wanted to point out here is this wasn't everything that could go wrong in cloud storage. So there's a lot of great resources out there to see what those potential issues could be, what the fallout could be if not taken care of properly, and how to fix them, of course. I'm just going to point out a few here. Of course, your vendors are going to have great documentation, not just on how to use their products, because they have to, right? They want customers to be successful in their environments, but a lot of these vendors will also put security guidance when using these services. Here's how to best lock them down. Here's how to use them in the most secure way possible. Now, is that read by the customer? Clearly, not all the time, based on those headings that we saw before from the news articles, but I recommend you do. Like if you're using S3 or you're using Azure virtual machines or GCP containers or what have you, look at the security documentation, because there's probably something that you might not be doing in a security sound way. We'll just put it nicely there. But also outside the vendors themselves, there are great third parties that come together as a community and put out guidance, like CIS, the Center for Internet Security. Them and many others will put out benchmark guides, baseline security guidance, and so on for AWS, Azure, Microsoft 365, Google, Oracle, you name it, right? If it's a pretty popular platform, whether it's cloud or an operating system or an application, there's likely going to be a CIS benchmark for it. I can't recommend that guidance enough. It does highlight a lot of potential issues there. So I mentioned before, I was an author of a course with SANS, one of them being SEC 488, Cloud Security Essentials. That's more or less what I built this workshop around. Interested students or even students that had taken the course, something that would land quite well with them. And we do have a number of opportunities coming up for the course to attend in person or a somewhat new version of teaching or modality, as they put it, live online. Where it's a live class, you're just attending from the comfort of your own home, the office, the hotel room, wherever you want to attend the course. So the couple worth highlighting here is CloudSec Next. It's the big SANS Cloud Security Conference over in Texas. Highly recommend you attend that. We have a great instructor for 488, Chris Edmondson, and that's happening October 18th. And we also have another one happening for those that are in the European theater or want to travel to Europe. We have Serge Borso teaching in Munich, the 16th through the 20th of October. Both of those, again, are either in person or you can attend live online. Just note the time zones, of course. Like if you're attending, I don't know, Munich from Hawaii, it's going to be maybe a little bit rough, or maybe you're trying to do this off hours. Maybe you're trying to work during the same time. So there's many more runs of 488 as well beyond just these two. If you're interested in this kind of stuff and want to learn a ton more about cloud security, fantastic class, if I do say so myself, right? And there's also the modality that's been around for quite some time, on demand, where you can take it over the course of 4 months with me. I taught this to a camera in a studio, so you can take the course anytime, anywhere as well, if you want to go that route at your own pace, if you were. It's not all condensed into a week. It's whatever pace you want to work on this, okay? And there's, of course, a GX certification for the course. It's been around for a little while now, the GCLD. So if you're interested in just adding to your resume, can't recommend that enough as well. What else did I want to have here? Oh, the rest of the cloud curriculum, what else is there? Because maybe you're not super focused in prevention and locking down buckets, but maybe you're more on the forensic side or more the detection side or more the pen testing side. There's likely a course for you across the SANS cloud curriculum. They put together, they being the cloud curriculum folks. Thank you very much, Laura, for all you do for the SANS cloud curriculum. Put together this flight plan. So depending on your role in your company or where you want to be in the future, possibly, there's a roadmap or a flight plan for courses that are recommended. Now, if you have some years in, let's say you've been in cloud for quite some time, it may not be necessary to do the 388 and the 488 before you get to the course maybe you ultimately desire, like a 541 or a 588, so a higher level course. But for those that are relatively new, I can't recommend 388 and 488 enough to bring you up to speed with cloud and cloud security, right? So take it for what it's worth. That's the flight plan at SANS. So last but not least, for the next few minutes, I'll be around for any Q&A you may have. I think I got all, there was one question that was asked early on. I said something about detection is hard in cloud or something along those lines. I don't think she's here right now, or she is. Here's your answer. What I meant by that was in cloud, there's some, well, take what you're monitoring on premise. You're still doing that in cloud. So things like host logging, application logging, database logging, Active Directory, all the wonderful logs, network logs that all come from that. You're just continuing to do that in cloud. But cloud also adds things like, well, if you're using a cloud service and it needs to be monitored, well, how do you do that? Well, many services do give you the option to turn on logging like we saw with S3. However, there's some delay sometimes in getting stood up. And even once it's been up for some time, maybe an hour or so, and I said the logs will arrive relatively quickly, it still may be minutes to several minutes before those activities are presented to you in some way, right? It's actually being saved as an artifact. So that's a little bit of a challenge in cloud. Again, I'm not picking on one vendor. A lot of them do operate this way. And also with cloud, you get things like API logging. So when you're interacting with the cloud environment, with your web browser or your cloud tools, you want to monitor that too, because if I'm evil Ryan and I steal your cloud credentials, you want to see what I'm up to. Fortunately, a lot of cloud vendors will capture those activities to some degree by default. But if you would attend a course like 541, for example, we show you what you're missing if you stick with those vendor defaults. There's a lot of things you have to turn on from the customer's perspective. And yes, it does add to cost, but do you want visibility or don't you want visibility is always my argument there. So lots to talk about. I could really go on a tirade about monitoring, but I think I've satisfied the answer and then some. All right. Anything else anyone may have? I see some chat in Zoom here. Let me pull that up just to see if I'm missing anything. All right. That's all Laura's chat. Thank you for all that wonderful information. Okay. Well, if I don't see anything else pop up in Slack here, I'll sign off. But for right now, I do have one more slide. It's just the stay in touch slide. I am on LinkedIn, so I'll take connections from anybody that has attended a workshop or someone I know. Just don't try to sell me more services or say you can 10x my organization. I'm sick of those invitations. So if it's like, hey, enjoyed the workshop, stay in touch. I occasionally will put out announcements like, hey, here's another workshop, or I'm teaching here, or congratulating folks that did very well in our end of course challenges and stuff like that. So I'm on LinkedIn. I also have my company email address there. If you're interested in services or consulting, I do that kind of stuff as well. But that's the last shameless plug I'll provide for myself. So hope you enjoyed it. I had a blast. I'll go on mute. The Zoom will probably be shutting off here soon. But again, I'll be on Slack. Just ping me if you need any help with the workshop if you're still working through those challenges. So thank you very much for attending.